Aurelia Noor trusted Rowan Halstead with her future, her freedom, and her life, but inside a high-rise apartment thousands of miles from home. That trust became the reason she'd never made it out alive. Aurelia Noor had lived most of her life near the Malaysian coast, in a town where everyone knew each other and traditions shaped every decision. Her upbringing was quiet and disciplined. Family honor mattered deeply, especially for women, and marriage was seen as the final proof of success. Aurelia was not rebellious, but she carried silent hopes of a broader world beyond familiar streets and predictable routines. She worked long hours, saved carefully, and spent evenings scrolling through social platforms that showed lives far different from her own. That was how she met Rowan Halstead. His profile stood out because it was controlled and formal. He presented himself as educated, morally strict, and financially stable. He spoke about responsibility, commitment, and respect. To Aurelia, his words felt safe. He seemed like someone who would protect her from uncertainty. Their online connection slowly became a daily routine, filled with long messages and carefully chosen photos. Rowan often spoke about how difficult it was to find a woman who valued purity and loyalty. Aurelia felt pressure to be perfect, but she also felt chosen. Over time, Rowan began discussing marriage. He emphasized how seriously he took it and how disappointed he was with modern relationships. He said he wanted a wife who would follow him completely, especially since he lived abroad. Aurelia's family was cautious at first, but Rowan's calm manners and financial security impressed them. He flew to Malaysia for a short visit, met her parents, and arranged a simple wedding without delay. Everything moved faster than Aurelia expected, but she believed hesitation would mean losing her chance at a better life. The wedding was modest but emotional. Aurelia wore a traditional dress, surrounded by relatives who reminded her how lucky she was. The idea of moving to Canada felt overwhelming, yet exciting. She imagined clean streets, independence, and a marriage built on mutual respect. She did not fully understand the legal and emotional dependence that would come with leaving her country. Soon after the wedding, Aurelia left Malaysia for the first time in her life. The flight felt endless. When she arrived in Vancouver, the cold air shocked her. Rowan's affections seemed quieter than before. He was polite but distant, focused on rules and schedules. The apartment he brought her to was high above the city, modern and spotless. From the balcony, the view was stunning. Aurelia believed this was the beginning of something secure, but small signs appeared almost immediately. Rowan insisted on organizing all her documents. He controlled her phone plan and bank access, explaining it was necessary for immigration reasons. He discouraged her from leaving the apartment alone, saying the city was dangerous and unfamiliar. Aurelia interpreted this as concern, not control. She spent her days inside, adjusting to a new language, environment, and a silent home. Rowan worked long hours and returned late, often tired and withdrawn. When Aurelia tried to ask questions about work permits or social connections, he brushed them aside. He reminded her that marriage meant trust and patience. At night, Aurelia often stood on the balcony, looking down at streets full of strangers. The height made her uneasy, but she told herself fear was normal in a new country. She did not realize that the apartment was not just high above the city, but far removed from help, witnesses, and escape. What Aurelia believed was a fresh beginning was slowly becoming a controlled space where her past, her freedom, and her voice would no longer belong to her. Life in Canada settled into a pattern that felt narrow and confining for Aurelia. Noor days blended into each other inside the apartment, broken only by the sound of traffic far below and the changing light through tall glass windows. Rowan Halstead controlled the rhythm of everything. He decided when meals were prepared, when lights were turned off, and when Aurelia was allowed to leave the apartment. He framed these decisions as discipline, something he believed a proper marriage required. Aurelia tried to adapt, convincing herself that structure would eventually bring peace. The isolation grew heavier with time. Rowan discouraged her from making friends, especially other immigrants. He said outside influence, corrupted values, and weakened loyalty. When Aurelia mentioned missing her family, Rowan reminded her that marriage meant starting over. He kept her passport locked away with other documents, claiming it was safer that way. Aurelia did not argue. She feared that questioning him would appear ungrateful or disobedient. Rowan's obsession with purity slowly surfaced. He asked intrusive questions about Aurelia's past. Not casually, but repeatedly, as if searching for cracks in her answers. He analyzed her reactions, her expressions, and even her silence. Aurelia sensed danger in these moments, but she did not know how to protect herself. She believed honesty was the only way to maintain stability. Before her marriage, Aurelia had once trusted someone who later disappeared from her life. It was a brief relationship, emotionally meaningful but long buried. She had never imagined it would follow her across continents. Rowan's questions forced memories she wanted to forget. She chose her words carefully, hoping not to awaken suspicion. But Rohan began searching for confirmation elsewhere. He monitored her medical records connected to immigration paperwork. He reviewed documents without explaining why. One evening, while Aurelia was cooking, Rowan sat quietly scrolling through files. His face hardened, and the silence became sharp. He said nothing, but something shifted permanently. From that moment, his behavior changed. He stopped touching her entirely. He began sleeping, facing away from her. His gaze turned cold. Evaluating, Aurelia felt like she was under constant inspection. Every action felt dangerous. Every mistake, unforgivable. Rowan became fixated on restoring control, he began, waking Aurelia early. Enforcing routines meant to break resistance. He limited her food intake under the excuse of health. He criticized her appearance, her habits, and her cultural background. He blamed her for not meeting expectations he had never fully explained. Aurelia felt guilt consume her. She believed her past had ruined her present. She started documenting her days privately, typing notes on her phone when Rowan was not around. She researched immigrant support resources, but fear stopped her from reaching out. Rowan often checked her devices, and the risk felt too great. As weeks passed, Rowan's anger became quiet but intense. He spent long hours online late at night. His search history later revealed an interest in punishment, honor, and legal boundaries. At the time, Aurelia only sensed that his thoughts were somewhere dark and unreachable. She began to feel unsafe in her own body. Careful with every movement, the apartment no longer felt like a shared space, but a monitored environment. The balcony door was often left open, letting in freezing air. Rowan claimed it helped clear his mind. Aurelia started experiencing panic, but she hid it. She believed endurance was her responsibility. She did not know that Rowan had already reached a conclusion about her worth, and that, in his mind, her fate was no longer uncertain but decided. The night everything changed arrived quietly, without warning or spectacle. Snow covered the city in a thin, muffled layer, softening sounds and slowing movement. Inside the high-rise building, most residents had retreated into their apartments early, sealed off from the cold and from one another. The hallways were still, and the security desk downstairs reported nothing unusual. Inside the apartment, tension had been building for days. Rowan Halstead moved through the space with rigid purpose, barely acknowledging Aurelia Noor's presence. His routines had become sharper, more deliberate, as if he were preparing for something final. Aurelia sensed the shift but could not understand its shape. She spent the evening in silence, careful not to draw attention, her body tight with unease. The apartment felt different that night. The air was colder, even with the heating on. The balcony door stood slightly open, letting in a narrow blade of winter air that cut through the room. Aurelia noticed it but did not close it. Small decisions no longer felt like they belonged. Time passed slowly. The city lights below flickered through the glass, distant and indifferent. Aurelia felt trapped between the height of the building and the weight of Rowan's presence. She thought about her family in Malaysia, about how far away they were, not just in distance but in awareness. No one knew how her life had narrowed into this quiet fear. Rowan's movements became more erratic. He paced the apartment, stopping, occasionally, to stare out at the city. His breathing was heavy, controlled but strained. Aurelia stayed still, hoping invisibility would protect her. She told herself that morning would come, that this night would pass like the others. At some point, the tension reached a breaking point. What happened next unfolded quickly, without witnesses and without mercy. The apartment, high above the frozen streets, offered no escape. The balcony, once a place where Aurelia searched for calm, became the edge of something irreversible. When Aurelia fell, the city did not react. Traffic continued below. Lights remained steady in neighboring buildings. No screams were heard by residents inside the tower, sealed behind glass and distanced. The height ensured silence. Hours passed before her body was discovered in the early morning darkness by a worker arriving for a routine shift. Emergency services were called, and the scene was secured. Police initially approached the case cautiously, unsure whether they were dealing with an accident, a mental health crisis, or something more deliberate. Inside the apartment, everything appeared orderly. No signs of struggle were immediately obvious. The balcony railing was intact. The door was closed. Aurelia's personal belongings were neatly arranged, almost intentionally so. Rowan presented himself as calm, cooperative, and devastated. He told investigators that Aurelia had been emotionally unstable, overwhelmed by immigration, stress, and isolation. His explanation fit a familiar narrative. Immigrant spouses under pressure sometimes suffered in silence. Without witnesses or clear physical evidence, suspicion remained muted. Rowan was not detained that night, but beneath the clean surfaces and controlled demeanor, The truth was already resisting containment. Digital traces, overlooked angles, and subtle inconsistencies waited quietly, ready to surface. What appeared to be a tragic fall would soon reveal itself as something far darker. As dawn broke over Vancouver, the snow continued to fall, covering the ground below the balcony. Aurelia Noor's life had ended in silence, but the story of how and why was only beginning. The investigation began slowly, almost cautiously, as if the truth needed time to decide whether it wanted to be found. Detective Marlon Keats reviewed the initial reports and felt an unease he could not immediately explain. Falls from balconies were not rare in the city, but something about this case felt too clean, too controlled. The apartment showed no obvious chaos, no broken objects, no visible signs of panic. It looked like a place prepared to be examined. Keats started with time. Rowan Halstead's account of the night was consistent but vague. He claimed to have been asleep and unaware until the morning. Yet building access logs showed no unusual activity, no visitors, no alarms. That should have closed the case quickly. But it did the opposite. Isolation created opportunity, and opportunity required scrutiny. The first crack appeared in digital records. Aurelia Noor's phone was missing. Rowan claimed she had dropped it earlier in the week. That explanation felt incomplete. Keats requested cloud data linked to Aurelia's accounts. What surfaced were unsent emails and drafted messages, saved automatically. They were not dramatic, but they carried fear. Aurelia had searched for immigration help, domestic abuse resources, and emergency shelters within the city. These searches were made late at night, repeatedly, then abruptly stopped days before her death. Next came the autopsy report. While the cause of death was consistent with a high fall, bruising on Aurelia's arms and upper torso raised questions. The injuries suggested restraint, not impact. They were recent and could not be explained by the fall alone. The medical examiner noted tension marks inconsistent with accidental movement. Keats turned back to the building. Security footage from within the tower showed nothing unusual. But footage from a neighboring building offered something unexpected. A reflection in a glass surface captured faint movement on the balcony around the estimated time of the fall. It was unclear, grainy, and indirect, but it showed more than one figure. The timing aligned too perfectly to ignore. Rowan's online activity became the next focus. A forensic review of his devices uncovered deleted searches related to punishment, immigration loopholes, and criminal sentencing in Canada. The searches were methodical, spaced over weeks, not hours. This was not panic-driven curiosity. It suggested planning. Financial records revealed additional pressure. Aurelia, Eve had no independent access to money. Her accounts were restricted, and transfers to family had been blocked. Her dependency was complete. Emails recovered from an old account showed she had attempted to explain her situation to someone back home, but stopped mid-message, never sending. As evidence grew, Rowan's controlled image began to weaken. Friends and coworkers described him as rigid and judgmental. He spoke often about moral failure and discipline. He showed little empathy toward emotional vulnerability. These descriptions painted a pattern, not a moment. When confronted with the accumulating evidence, Rowan's explanations shifted. Small inconsistencies appeared. Times changed slightly. Details blurred. The calm certainty that once protected him began to fracture. The case was no longer about a fall. It became a story of control, obsession, and calculated silence. Aurelia's isolation, once invisible, now explained everything. The apartment had been a closed system where power went unchecked. By the time charges were prepared, the narrative had fully reversed. What was first treated as tragedy was now recognized as violence hidden behind order. The balcony was no longer a place of uncertainty but a weapon chosen for its finality. As the case moved toward court, one truth stood firm. Aurelia Noor had not fallen because she was weak or unstable. She had been pushed into silence long before her body ever left the balcony. The arrest of Rowan Halstead sent shockwaves far beyond the city where Aurelia Noor had died. What began as a quiet case quickly became a public reckoning. Media outlets across Canada and Southeast Asia followed every development, focusing on the hidden dangers faced by immigrant spouses living in isolation. Rowan was taken into custody without resistance, his composure intact. But the image he had carefully maintained no longer protected him. The trial revealed the full scope of Aurelia's trapped existence. Prosecutors presented a timeline that showed deliberate control rather than sudden rage. They detailed how Rowan had isolated Aurelia from financial independence, social connections, and legal awareness. Her immigration status had been used as leverage, her silence mistaken for consent. The court heard how Rowan's beliefs had hardened into justification, transforming suspicion into punishment. Expert testimony dismantled the argument that cultural expectations explained the violence. The court made it clear that belief systems do not excuse harm. Evidence showed that Rowan understood the law and had researched its limits. This knowledge became proof of intent. He had not acted impulsively. He had acted with calculation. Digital records gave Aurelia a voice she never had in life. Her searches, unfinished messages, and restricted access painted a picture of a woman quietly preparing for escape. The jury learned that she had been planning to ask for help, not planning to end her life. The absence of a suicide note, combined with physical evidence of restraint, erased any remaining doubt. Rowan's defense collapsed under the weight of consistency. His changing explanations contrasted sharply with the steady narrative built from data and expert analysis. The image of a disciplined, morally upright man fractured completely. What remained was someone who believed control was entitlement and punishment was correction. When the verdict was delivered, the courtroom was silent. Rowan Halstead was found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, with no chance of parole for many years. The ruling emphasized accountability and protection for those vulnerable within marriages formed across borders. Aurelia Noor's family attended the sentencing remotely from Malaysia. They spoke of a daughter who believed in love, who trusted that honesty and patience would lead to safety. They described the pain of distance, not just geographic, but emotional, created by systems that failed to protect her sooner. In the years that followed, Aurelia's case became part of training materials for law enforcement and immigration support services. Her story helped change screening procedures and increased funding for immigrant spouse outreach programs. What had been ignored before could no longer be dismissed as private. Family matters. The apartment where Aurelia lived was eventually sold. New residents moved in, unaware of the quiet terror once contained within its walls. The balcony remained unchanged, but its meaning had shifted. It no longer symbolized height or freedom, but the consequences of unchecked control. Aurelia Noor did not live to see justice, but her story forced it into existence. Her life ended in silence, but her legacy continues as a warning and a call to protect those whose voices are easy to overlook.